For our second progression, we'll be working with something a bit unusual for standard neoclassical styles, and that makes it stand apart from the other progressions in this course. This progression modulates almost constantly, and is in the keys of A minor, B flat, and A major. You'll notice that while this progression doesn't have that standard neoclassical sound, it still captures a specific classical music feel. This is a great example of the potential for neoclassical as a style inspired by classical music. In my opinion, a lot of guitarists and musicians have a tendency to get too stuck on particulars of a genre as it's defined by staples or cliches of that genre. The trouble is, this can lead to stagnation in the genre and can very easily stunt a guitarist or musician's growth in the process. In my opinion, it's extremely important to always be looking out for something new or different to try out, whether it be big or small. That way, we can all be growing together as musicians, and all of us can be instrumental in the evolution of the style and art form in general. For the first exercise of this progression, we have a simple descending A minor 5-string suite. You should notice that this is simply the descending version of the same A minor arpeggio we used in exercise 5. If you've studied my other courses, then you know that I normally work pretty hard to eliminate any kind of redundancy in the exercises, utilizing the idea of movable patterns as one avenue, and rarely or never separating the same pattern into its ascending and descending forms. So this exercise may seem strange in that context, since technically we've already gone over this pattern. But for the sake of this course, I want you to look at these compositions differently. While the patterns found in this course will utilize some common suite patterns, either in their entirety or in parts, as we progress through the course, you'll see that we'll be modifying the patterns considerably to suit the needs of the composition. Using the patterns you already know as a starting point will help expedite the learning and memorization of these progressions, but that will be nowhere near enough to rely on for the bulk of this course. So I want you to see this exercise as a melody that simply happens to be played in a familiar pattern. From this perspective, the fact that you've already gone over an identical pattern is just a lucky break that will help you learn this composition more quickly. This isn't about a 5-string descending suite pattern, but simply a means to play these notes in this particular order for the sake of the progression. Because of the simplicity of these first two progressions, that may not seem like it makes a lot of sense right now, but the idea will become a lot clearer as we get deeper into the overall course. For the next exercise, we again have a common 5-string suite pattern. This time, we're playing it ascending. This is the major version now of the same pattern we used in exercise 5, or that we just used in exercise 15. This is a B-flat arpeggio. While we're starting out in this course with some simple arpeggios in standard suite patterns, don't get used to it. Pretty soon, things are going to get quite a bit more interesting, and we'll continue to diverge from standard patterns and simple arpeggios more and more as we move through the progressions. This next exercise is an E major 5-string suite pattern. This time we're using a different shape that, starting on the 5th string, causes the arpeggio to be in first inversion. If you're not familiar with inversions, it simply refers to when a chord or arpeggio is played with a note other than the root note as the lowest pitch. As I'm sure you know by now, chords or arpeggios are based on a triad, whether major, minor, diminished, or augmented. The triad is made up of the root, the 3rd, and 5th intervals. First inversion is when the 3rd is played as the lowest pitch. Second inversion is when the 5th is the lowest pitch. And for chords that use a 7th, you can have 3rd inversion, where the 7th is the lowest pitch. And we're just going over inversions here briefly. It's not going to be a major focus of this course. So we'll soon get away from pointing it out or even labeling the patterns that way. So if you're not already familiar with inversions and you're interested in learning more about them, pay close attention to what note we use as the root note of any arpeggio pattern in this course. Anyway, moving back to the pattern itself, you'll notice that we're using a rolling bar on the 9th fret of the 4th, 3rd, and 2nd strings. If you've gone through my course, Sweep Picking Mastery, you'll recognize this type of shape as what we referred to as the third type of pattern, or labeled it as V3. The pattern from exercise 5, and that we used in the previous two exercises, would fall under the second type, or V2, under that system of designation from that course. Now, it would be too off topic for this course to spend a lot of time on that idea of categorizing patterns. But very briefly, I'll just say that standard movable sweep arpeggio patterns can be broken down into three categories. In Sweep Picking Mastery, we designate patterns based on the 6-string root note bar chord shape as the first type, patterns based on the open position 5-string C chord shape as the second type, and patterns based on the 5-string root note bar chord shape as the third type. This next pattern is based on the same pattern used for exercise 17. This time, however, it's an E7 arpeggio. As notes such as a seventh are added to a sweep arpeggio, the number of ways the arpeggio can be voiced increase dramatically. In the case of a 5-string pattern like this, there are 3 positions and octaves where the seventh could be played. These can be played with 2 notes on the same string for the first 2 octaves, or up to 3 notes on one string for the highest octave. If we simply added these octaves, we could get 2 notes on the same string where the first 2 octaves are found, or up to 3 notes on the same string for the highest octave. These 3 octaves of the seventh can either be played in addition to all the other notes on those strings, or instead of them. And of course, you could play any one of those 3 octaves, or up to all 3. In the case of this pattern, we're only playing the second available octave of the seventh, and that occurs on the 3rd string in this pattern. And we're replacing an instance of the root note E instead of playing both notes on the 3rd string. In other words, instead of playing both the 7th and the 2nd octave of the root on the same string, we're skipping that root note altogether and just playing the 7th on the 3rd string. You may notice that the resulting pattern is actually very similar to a type of diminished sweep arpeggio pattern. That's because a standard 7th chord without the root is actually equivalent to a standard diminished triad. In other words, the 3rd, 5th, and 7th of a standard 7th chord is equivalent to the root, 3rd, and 5th of a diminished triad. This is extremely relevant to the neoclassical style. We'll be getting much deeper into that with examples of how it can be used for neoclassical later in the course. For this next pattern, we're playing an F7 arpeggio on 5 strings. This pattern is almost the same as the E7 pattern from exercise 18, except for the fact that it's ascending instead of descending, and now we have a hammer-on the 5th string instead of the pull-off on the 1st string. The E7 pattern from exercise 18 was in first inversion, using the 3rd as the lowest pitch. This pattern extends down to the root note on the 5th string. Since these patterns are using straight 8th triplets, in order for this to fit the measure, we had to shave off another note in order to accommodate the addition of the low octave. So we effectively traded the high octave of the root on the 1st string for the low octave of the root on the 5th string. Of course, in reality, these decisions were made for how they would work melodically, and the changes and similarities resulted from finding practical solutions to making the melody efficiently playable. Here we have another 7th arpeggio, this time a B flat 7. However, that's about the only similarity between this pattern and the previous two. In this case, we're breaking away from standard sweep patterns for the pure sake of transitioning between multiple positions on the fretboard. While you can't see where we're moving towards yet, the slide that occurs as we switch from descending to ascending is preparing us for the next pattern. Outside of that context, the fingering here makes very little sense. But when you put this together with the previous pattern and the following pattern, you'll see the necessity of it. Notice that we slide with the 3rd finger immediately into a rolling bar. This is a pretty awkward transition in itself, and I recommend spending some extra time on it to make sure you're comfortable with it before continuing. For the last section of this progression, we go back to the E7. This time we're starting by playing a high octave of the major third on the 16th fret of the first string. The previous exercise used that strange slide and fingering in order to set us up to use the fourth finger on the 16th fret at the start of this pattern. We then pull off to the 12th fret and immediately change positions again by sliding down to the 7th fret with the first finger. After that, you'll recognize the remaining notes as making up a large part of the pattern from exercise 18. Now, considering that this is the last pattern found in this progression, going through all that trouble may seem strange and unnecessary. However, the reason why we're sliding back down again is to make it easier to repeat the entire progression again from the beginning. You'll notice the same practice in several other progressions in this course. To avoid so much awkward sliding around, you could also tap the 16th fret with a finger on your picking hand. The reason we aren't doing that here is simply to demonstrate this type of transition and to save the tapping for later progressions. Keep in mind that you could have a situation where you're playing practically the same thing, except you also need to tap a note much higher on the first string. In that case, you'd be forced to use a transition like this, so it's absolutely worth mastering. After you've mastered this the way it's written, I'd recommend playing around with tapping the 16th fret instead, and then working out an alternative method of playing this and the previous exercise. Now we simply put the whole thing together. Pay close attention to the transitions between each measure so you can see why we've done these fingerings and techniques that we have and see how it's been optimized. Save for one exception, we won't be focusing on transitions between exercises as exercises in their own right. This is purely for efficiency and to avoid unnecessary redundancy. However, at some point you'll find that the transitions between the segments will become treble sections. This is where that practice method of isolating and practicing treble sections comes into play. You can either take two entire exercises and practice them back to back until you're comfortable with the transition. But if it's only the transition itself that's giving you difficulty, you can work out a much shorter exercise just made up of the relevant notes to the treble section. As I mentioned earlier in the course, this could be as few as the last two notes of one exercise practiced together with the first two notes of the next exercise. As with all the progressions in this course, I strongly recommend that you spend enough time to get it down before moving on. You really don't have to be able to play it at full tempo. You just want to get it down to where you can comfortably play it evenly with a metronome, and that's without stopping or pausing at a medium tempo. If you rush through it and practice it sloppy, all you'll really achieve is cementing sloppy playing habits. Put the time in now, and it will ensure you get all the benefits and prepare you for the increases in difficulty as this course progresses.